When ambitious marketing director Emma Chen needs a date for the most important business event of her career, she makes a desperate decision that changes everything. What she doesn't know is that her hired escort is actually billionaire David, Sterling's ruthless CEO, planning to destroy her company. What happens when fake romance becomes real love? What's the price of ambition in Manhattan's corporate world? Can love survive when it's built on lies and betrayal? Asterisk, welcome back, beautiful people. This story is where drama meets devotion and where one glance can rewrite destiny. Asterisk, the champagne flute trembled in Emma Chen's manicured fingers as she surveyed the Mandarin Oriental's glittering ballroom. Crystal chandeliers cast prismatic light across Manhattan's elite, their laughter and whispered business deals creating a symphony of ambition that made her chest tight. She had clawed her way to this moment for 7 years, sacrificing relationships, sleep, and pieces of her soul to reach marketing director at Pinnacle Advertising. Tonight would determine if she finally claimed a partnership or remained forever, trapped in the suffocating middle tier of corporate hierarchy. The emerald silk dress clung to her frame like liquid confidence, but beneath its perfect drape, her heart hammered against her ribs. Richard Hampton's words from earlier still echoed in her mind like a death sentence. The Hartwell Foundation contract is worth $12 million. Don't disappoint me. She touched the diamond pendant at her throat, a gift to herself after her last promotion, and scanned the crowd for familiar faces. Her phone buzzed with another message from her assistant about last-minute presentation changes. The familiar knot of anxiety twisted tighter in her stomach. You look like you're planning someone's murder. The voice came from directly behind her, smooth as aged whiskey, with an undertone that suggested danger. Emma turned and found herself face to face with a man who shouldn't exist outside of magazine covers or movie screens, tall enough that she had to tilt her head back despite her 4-inch heels, with dark hair that looked deliberately tousled and gray eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of her face. "Excuse me?" she managed, noting how his black tuxedo fit, like it had been sewn directly onto his broad shoulders. "The expression," he said, moving closer until she caught the subtle scent of bergamot and something darker. Pure calculation mixed with barely contained violence. "I've worn it myself at these events." Emma felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I don't believe we've been introduced." David Sterling. He extended a hand that swallowed hers completely. "And you're Emma Chen, the marketing director who's about to revolutionize how nonprofits tell their stories." The fact that he knew her name and her upcoming presentations sent warning signals through her nervous system. "How do you? Your reputation precedes you. I make it my business to know the most dangerous people in any room." Something in his tone made her study his face more carefully. There were lines around his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and difficult decisions. A small scar bisected his left eyebrow, barely visible unless you were looking for signs of a complicated past. "Dangerous seems like an overstatement," Emma said, though she couldn't help the small smile that tugged at her lips. "Is it David's?" Gaze dropped to her mouth for just a moment, before returning to her eyes. "You've dismantled 3 rival campaigns this year, poached their best talent, and somehow convinced the Morrison Group to triple their advertising budget, all while looking like you stepped out of Vogue." The accuracy of his information should have alarmed her, but instead she felt a thrill of recognition. Someone had actually noticed her work, understood the strategy behind her successes. "You've done your homework," she said. "I always research the competition." Before she could ask what he meant, Richard Hampton's booming laugh cut through the ambient noise. Emma's stomach clenched as she spotted him approaching with the entire Hartwell Foundation board in tow, their expressions ranging from politely interested to openly skeptical. "Emma, darling," Richard's voice carried across the space between them. "There you are. The Hartwells are eager to discuss the campaign." David's hand touched the small of her back, the contact sending electricity up her spine. "Showtime," he murmured in her ear. She turned to thank him for the distraction, but he was already melting back into the crowd with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to disappearing when convenient. Emma watched him go, noting how other guests seemed to recognize him, how conversations paused as he passed. "Emma." Richard's voice had taken on that edge that meant she was keeping important people waiting. She plastered on her professional smile and approached the group. But her mind kept drifting to gray eyes, and the way David had said her name like he'd been waiting years to speak it aloud. The presentation went flawlessly. Emma fielded questions about demographic targeting and multimedia integration with the confidence born of countless hours of preparation. But as she spoke about reaching younger donors through authentic storytelling, she found herself scanning the crowd for a familiar tall frame. She spotted him near the bar, apparently deep in conversation with someone she couldn't see clearly. The sight of him made her falter mid-sentence about conversion metrics. "Miss Chen." Margaret Hartwell's voice cut through her distraction. "You were saying about the projected ROI?" Emma snapped back to attention, delivering her closing remarks with renewed focus. When the applause died down and hands were shaken, she felt the familiar rush of victory. The contract was as good as signed. But when she looked toward the bar again, David had vanished. "Impressive work tonight," a voice said behind her. Emma spun around, expecting David, but found herself facing a woman in her 50s with silver hair and sharp eyes. Catherine Reed, the woman, introduced herself. "I handle public relations for Sterling Industries." Emma's blood turned to ice water. Sterling Industries. The multinational corporation that had been systematically acquiring smaller marketing firms across the city. The company that many suspected was positioning to make a hostile takeover of Pinnacle Advertising. "I'm sorry," Emma said carefully, "but I'm not sure why you're introducing yourself to me." Catherine's smile was razor-thin. "Hey, Mr. Sterling asked me to give you this." She handed Emma a cream-colored business card with nothing but a phone number written in elegant script. "He said you'd understand when you were ready." The woman disappeared into the crowd, leaving Emma staring at the card. Her hands were shaking again, but this time it wasn't from nerves. It was from the slowly dawning realization that she had just spent 20 minutes flirting with the man who might be planning to destroy everything she'd worked for. The ballroom suddenly felt too small, too warm. Emma made her excuses to Richard and fled toward the ladies' room, her heels clicking against marble like gunshots. In the mirror above the vanity, her reflection looked pale and shaken. She pulled out her phone and Googled David Sterling. The results made her legs weak. CEO of Sterling Industries, net worth estimated at $2.3 billion, known for aggressive acquisitions and restructuring, no public relationships, no social media presence. A ghost who moved through financial circles like smoke. Emma stared at her reflection and tried to reconcile the man who had made her laugh with the corporate predator described in Forbes articles. The man whose touch had made her forget her own name was the same person who could end her career with a single phone call. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "The car is waiting outside. We need to talk." Emma's reflection stared back at her, emerald dress now feeling like armor that wouldn't protect her from what was coming. She had two choices. Go home, pretend this never happened, and wait for Sterling Industries to make their move. Or step into the car of a man who represented everything she feared most and find out exactly how much danger she was in. The bathroom door seemed impossibly heavy as she pushed it open and walked toward whatever David Sterling really wanted from her. The black Mercedes idled outside the Mandarin Oriental like a predator waiting to strike. Emma's reflection wavered in its tinted windows as she approached, her emerald dress a splash of color against the vehicle's obsidian surface. The doorman opened the rear door without being asked, as if David Sterling's reach extended even to hotel staff. David sat in the far corner of the leather interior, having traded his tuxedo jacket for a casual confidence that somehow made him more intimidating. City lights streaked past the windows, painting his angular features in shifting patterns of gold and shadow. "You came," he said without looking at her. "And did I have a choice?" Emma slid across the seat, maintaining distance between them, despite the car's spacious interior. There's always a choice. That's what separates survivors from casualties in this business. The driver navigated through Manhattan. Traffic with the fluid expertise of someone accustomed to transporting people who couldn't afford to be seen together. Emma watched David's profile as he stared out the window. Noting the tension in his jaw and the way his fingers drummed against his knee. "Sterling Industries," she said finally. "You're him. Guilty as charged." "Are you planning to acquire?" "Pinnacle." David turned to face her then, and the intensity in his gray eyes made her breath catch. that depends entirely on you. The car pulled into the underground garage of a gleaming tower that scraped the belly of low-hanging clouds. Emma recognized the building from business magazines, but had never imagined she'd enter it as anything other than a conquering hero or a defeated enemy. The elevator ride to the 47th floor passed in loaded silence. David's presence filled the small space until Emma felt like she was breathing him in with every inhale. When the doors opened into a penthouse office that looked like it belonged in Architectural Digest, she finally understood the scope of what she was dealing with. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city that glittered like scattered diamonds. The furniture was modern and expensive. All clean lines and muted colors that spoke of wealth so profound it didn't need to announce itself. But it was the wall of monitors displaying real-time financial data that made Emma's stomach clench with recognition. Impressive, she managed. It serves its purpose. David moved to a bar cart and poured 2 glasses of what looked like very expensive scotch. But you didn't come here to admire my decorator's work. Emma accepted the glass, but didn't drink. The amber liquid caught the city lights like liquid fire. Why me? Because you're the only person at Pinnacle worth saving. The bluntness of his words hit her like a physical blow. Saving from what? David walked to the windows, his reflection, ghost-like against the sprawling city below. Your company is hemorrhaging money. The Hartwell contract you just secured won't be enough to cover the debts Richard's been hiding from his investors. Pinnacle has maybe 6 months before bankruptcy. Emma felt the world tilt beneath her feet. That's impossible. Our quarterly reports are masterfully creative fiction. David's voice was gentle, but his words cut like surgical steel. Richard's been cooking the books for 2 years. I have the real numbers, if you'd like to see them. Scotch burned her throat as Emma finally took a sip, needing the liquid courage. How do you know all this? Because I've been investigating Pinnacle for months, not for acquisition for. You. She nearly dropped the glass. For me? David turned from the window, and something vulnerable flickered across his features before the mask of corporate control slid back into place. 5 years ago, you destroyed a campaign that would have launched my ex-wife's political career. The Morrison account that made your reputation? That was her stepping stone to the governor's mansion. Emma's mind raced through her past victories, landing on a particularly brutal campaign where she'd exposed a candidate's husband's financial irregularities. The woman had withdrawn from the race and scandal, but Emma had never connected the dots to David Sterling. Melissa Cartwright, she whispered. Melissa Sterling, when she bothered to use my name? His laugh was bitter. She cost me more than money when she left. She took proprietary information, client lists, and enough insider knowledge to nearly destroy everything I'd built. The pieces of David's puzzle began clicking into place in Emma's mind. You blame me for your divorce? I blamed you for? A lot of things. He moved closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of silver in his gray eyes. Until I started watching you work, till I realized you'd done me the biggest favor of my life by showing me exactly who I'd married. Emma's heart hammered against her ribs as David reached out to touch her cheek with fingers that trembled almost imperceptibly. Watching you became an obsession, he continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Your intelligence, your ruthlessness, the way you refuse to apologize for being better than everyone else in the room. You're magnificent when you're destroying someone's dreams. The admission sent heat spiraling through Emma's core, even as warning bells screamed in her head. So this is revenge? Some elaborate plan to humiliate me? No. David's thumb traced along her jawline. This is me offering you everything you've ever wanted. Before she could ask what he meant, his mouth was on hers. The kiss was hungry and desperate, tasting of scotch and secrets. Emma's professional instincts screamed at her to push him away, but her body had other ideas. She melted into him, her hands fisting in his shirt as 5 years of antagonistic chemistry combusted between them. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. The offer Emma managed. David stepped back, but his eyes never left her face. Come work for me, not as an employee, as a partner. Sterling Industries has marketing contracts worth more than Pinnacle's entire annual revenue. You'd have unlimited resources, complete creative control, and a salary that would make Richard Hampton weep. Emma's mind spun with possibilities, even as her heart raced from the kiss. Everything David offered represented the pinnacle of her professional dreams. But the cost. What about Pinnacle? Pinnacle dies regardless. The question is whether you go down with the ship or step onto the life raft I'm offering. The brutal truth in his words made her stomach clench. And if I say no, something dangerous flashed in David's eyes. Then you'll have the privilege of watching me acquire your company's assets at bankruptcy auction while you're updating your LinkedIn profile? The threat was delivered with such casual menace that Emma felt a chill run down her spine. This was the David Sterling from the business magazine Ruthless, calculating someone who collected victories like other people collected antiques. I need time to think, she said. 24 hours. David walked to his desk and pulled out a contract that was already prepared. Sign this, and tomorrow you start building an empire. Don't sign it, and tomorrow you start job hunting. Emma stared at the contract without reading it, her mind reeling. Why should I trust you? 'Cause unlike everyone else in your life, I'm not pretending to be something I'm not. David's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. I'm offering you exactly what I am. A beautiful monster who can give you everything you want if you're willing to become one too. The elevator doors closed behind Emma 20 minutes later, but David's words echoed in her head like a curse she couldn't shake. The contract burned in her purse like radioactive material, offering her dreams she'd never dared voice even to herself. As the car pulled away from Sterling Tower, Emma caught a glimpse of David watching from his office window, a dark silhouette against the glittering city. She pulled out her phone and scrolled to Richard's number, her finger hovering. Over the call button, she could warn him about the bankruptcy, could give Pinnacle a fighting chance to save itself. Or she could take David's offer and watch the place that had been her professional home for 7 years crumble to dust. The phone screen reflected her face, and for a moment she saw a stranger staring back, someone who looked hungry enough to devour the world if given the chance. Emma put the phone away without making the call and settled back into the leather seat. Outside the window, Manhattan sparkled with the promise of power and the terrible price of ambition. 24 hours to decide who she really was beneath the polished exterior she'd spent years perfecting. 24 hours to choose between the woman she'd been and the monster she might become. The car disappeared into the river of traffic, carrying her toward a decision that would define the rest of her life. Emma's apartment felt like a museum of her former life as she paced across the hardwood floors at 3 a.m. The contract lay spread across her glass dining table like tarot cards, predicting a future she wasn't sure she wanted to see. Every clause was more generous than the last salary. Benefits, equity stakes, that would make her wealthy beyond imagination. But it was the termination clause that made her hands shake as she read it for the dozenth time. If she ever left Sterling Industries, she would be barred from working in marketing for any company David deemed a competitor. Given his reach, that would mean professional exile. Golden handcuffs disguised as opportunity. Her phone buzzed with a text from David. Having second thoughts is normal. Having third thoughts means you're not the woman I thought you were. Emma hurled the device across the room, watching it skitter under her couch. Manipulation and his words was masterful, claying her pride while offering an escape route that felt like surrender. She walked to her window and stared out at the city that had shaped her from idealistic college graduate into the ruthless professional she'd become. Somewhere out there, Richard Hampton was probably sleeping peacefully, unaware that his empire was built on financial quicksand. Her colleagues were dreaming about promotions in corner offices that might not exist in 6 months. The weight of their trust pressed against her chest like a stone. By 7 a.m., Emma had made her decision. She dressed in her sharpest suit, black Armani, that made her look like she could slice through steel with her gazine, called a car to take her to Pinnacle's offices. If David wanted an answer, he could have it. But first, she needed to understand exactly how deep Richard's deception ran. Pinnacle Advertising occupied 3 floors of a converted warehouse in Soho. Its brick walls and exposed beams giving it the creative atmosphere that had initially drawn Emma to the company. She used her keycard to enter the financial floor, her heels echoing in the empty corridors like gunshots. Richard's office door was locked, but Emma had learned to pick locks during a misspent semester in college. The skill had served her well in corporate espionage over the years. His computer required no such finesse. Richard had always been careless with passwords. Using his wife's birthday for everything, what she found in the hidden files made her stomach turn. David hadn't been exaggerating. If anything, he'd been generous in his assessment. Pinnacle was drowning in debt, propped up by increasingly desperate measures that would have impressed Bernie Madoff. Fake invoices, inflated billings, money shuffled between accounts like a shell game designed to fool auditors. The Hartwell contract she'd secured last night wouldn't save them. It would barely keep them afloat for 3 months. Find what you were looking for. Emma spun around to find Richard Hampton standing in his office doorway. Coffee in hand, and disappointment etched across his weathered features. He looked older than she remembered, the weight of his secrets aging him in ways she'd been too focused on her own ambitions to notice. Richard, she straightened, not bothering to deny what she'd been doing. How long have you known, I'd figure? It out about 6 months. You're too smart not to notice the discrepancies eventually. He walked to his desk and sat down heavily, suddenly looking every one of his 63 years. I suppose David Sterling made you an offer you can't refuse. The casual way, he said. David's name sent ice through Emma's veins. You know about him? Richard's laugh was bitter. Emma, sweetheart, I've been in this business for 30 years. I know when someone's sniffing around my company. The question is what he offered you to jump ship. Heat flooded Emma's cheeks as she realized how thoroughly she'd been played. You knew he was investigating us. I knew he was investigating you. The company was just collateral damage. Richard leaned back in his chair, studying her with the expression of a man watching his favorite protege grow up and break his heart. Simultaneously, I also know about his ex-wife and the campaign you destroyed. Quite a coincidence that he'd suddenly develop an interest in our marketing director. Emma felt the walls of David's manipulation closing around her like a trap. Every conversation, every touch, every kiss had been calculated. She'd been so focused on her attraction to him that she'd missed the obvious signs of a man orchestrating an elaborate revenge. Why didn't you warn me? Because I hoped you'd choose loyalty over opportunity. Richard's voice was heavy with resignation. I built this company from nothing, Emma. Every campaign, every victory, every late night when we celebrated landing impossible clients. You were part of that. You were family. The word hit her like a physical blow. Family. The thing she'd sacrificed for career advancement. The relationships she'd burned in service of ambition. Richard had been more of a father to her than her own had ever managed. The bankruptcy, she said quietly, will happen whether you stay or go. But if you stay, at least we'll fight together. If you leave, he shrugged, Sterling acquires our assets, our clients, and probably our office space. Everyone else gets unemployment benefits and bitter memories. Emma stared at the financial documents scattered across Richard's desk, seeing her colleagues' futures crumbling like autumn leaves. Sarah from graphic design, who was finally saving enough to buy a house. Marcus from strategy, whose wife had just had twins. Whose livelihoods depended on decisions being made in boardrooms they'd never see. Her phone, retrieved from under her couch that morning, buzzed with another message from David. The car will be at your building at noon. Don't disappoint me. What would you do? Ma asked Richard. If I were 29, brilliant, and had an offer that could set me up for life. Richard considered the question seriously. I'd probably take it. But I'd spend the rest of my career wondering who I might have been if I'd chosen differently. Emma folded the contract and slipped it into her purse. I need to go, I know. Richard stood and walked around his desk to embrace her. For a moment, she was 22 again, terrified and eager, listening to him explain the cutthroat nature of their business. Whatever you choose, Emma, you'll survive. You always do. The car was waiting when she arrived at her apartment building. David sat in the back seat, looking like he'd stepped out of a magazine spread about powerful men who collected trophies. He smiled when she slid in beside him, but something predatory flickered behind his eyes. Have you made your decision? Emma pulled out the contract and set it between them. I have questions first. Ask them. Is this really about offering me opportunities, or is this about destroying the woman who ruined your marriage? David's smile never wavered. Does the motivation matter if the outcome benefits you? It does if you're planning to discard me once you've gotten your revenge. Emma. David leaned closer, his voice dropping to that intimate register that made her pulse race despite everything. What happened between Melissa and me is ancient history. What's happening between you and me is about the future. The car pulled up to Sterling Tower, but Emma made no move to get out. Prove it, she said. David raised an eyebrow. How? Give me the Hartwell Foundation account. All of it. Make it my first project at Sterling Industries. What? Something sharp flashed in David's eyes. The Hartwell contract was worth $12 million to whatever agency secured it. For him to simply hand it over would represent a gesture of trust that went beyond business calculation. And if I refuse, know exactly where I stand in your grand plan. David stared at her for a long moment, weighing calculations she couldn't read. Finally, he pulled out his phone and made a call. Catherine, it's David. Contact the Hartwell Foundation and let them know Sterling Industries will be honoring their contract with Pinnacle Advertising. Emma Chen will be handling their account personally. He paused, listening. Yes, I'm aware of the implications. Do it anyway. When he hung up, Emma felt something shift between them. Not trust exactly, but recognition. They were both predators who understood the price of survival in waters filled with sharks. Satisfied? David asked. Emma signed the contract with bold strokes that felt like signing away her soul. We'll see. As they walked into Sterling Tower together, Emma caught their reflection in the polished elevator doors. They looked like they belonged together, too. Beautiful, dangerous people who'd found their perfect match. But she couldn't shake the feeling that David's gesture, generous as it appeared, was just another move in a game she didn't fully understand yet. 3 months into her tenure at Sterling Industries, Emma had transformed from rising executive into corporate royalty. Her corner office on the 45th floor offered views that made Manhattan look like a conquered territory spread before her feet. The Hartwell Foundation campaign had exceeded every projection, generating not just revenue, but industry recognition that established her as one of the most formidable marketing strategists in the city. But success felt different when it came. Wrapped in silk ties and whispered promises in David's penthouse bed, their relationship had evolved from professional partnership into something more dangerous than either had anticipated. David was attentive, generous, intellectually challenging in ways that made her previous relationships seem like practice runs for the real thing. Yet beneath the surface of their perfect corporate romance, Emma sensed currents she couldn't navigate. She was reviewing quarterly reports when Catherine Reed knocked on her door, her expression more troubled than usual. We need to talk, Catherine said, closing the door behind her with the careful precision of someone delivering bad news. Emma gestured to the chair across from her desk. Over the past months, Catherine had become something approaching a friend. One of the few people at Sterling who remembered what it felt like to be an outsider in David's world. What's wrong? Catherine pulled out a tablet and set it on Emma's desk. I've been digging into the Pinnacle acquisition since David asked me to expedite the process. What I found doesn't match the narrative you've been told. The documents on the screen made Emma's blood turn cold. Purchase agreements, asset transfers, and most damning of all, communications between David and Richard Hampton dating back 18 months. Long before Emma had ever met David at the charity gala, they'd been negotiating the sale of Pinnacle for over a year, Catherine said quietly. Richard needed a cash infusion to cover the debt. David needed the client roster and the real estate. It was always going to be a win-win for both men. Emma's hands shook as she scrolled through email chains discussing personnel retention, office closures, and which employees would be offered positions at Sterling Industries. Her name appeared repeatedly, but not as a potential hire. To be acquired along with everything else? The bankruptcy story? True, but manageable if Richard had accepted David's initial offer 18 months ago. He held out for a better deal, hoping to find another buyer. When that failed, David sweetened the pot with promises about key personnel transitions. Emma felt sick as the scope of David's manipulation became clear. The chance meeting at the charity gala, his knowledge of her work, even his supposed attraction to Harold of it had been orchestrated to ensure her cooperation in the acquisition. Why are you showing me this? Catherine's expression was grave. "'Cause tomorrow David plans to announce the pinnacle acquisition at the board meeting. He's positioning it as a brilliant strategic move, using their client relationships and your expertise to expand Sterling's market share. What he hasn't told you is that once the acquisition is complete, he's planning to eliminate most of Pinnacle's workforce." The tablet felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds as Emma set it down, including Richard. Richard gets a consulting fee that will keep him comfortable for about 2 years. After that, he's on his own. The rest of your former colleagues get standard severance packages and job search assistance. Emma stared out her window at the city below, thinking about Sarah and Marcus and all the other people whose professional lives were about to be dismantled so David could add their clients to his portfolio. People who trusted her, who'd probably been expecting her to help navigate whatever came next. "There's something else," Catherine said softly. "David's ex-wife, Melissa. Oh. She didn't leave him because of the campaign you destroyed. She left because she found out about his affairs. Multiple affairs, all with women who worked for companies he later acquired." The words hit Emma like physical blows. "How many?" 7 over the past 10 years. All brilliant, all ambitious, all women who could help him gain access to their company's internal operations. Most lasted about 6 months after the acquisitions were complete. Emma thought about the past 3 months, about David's hands on her skin and his whispered words about building an empire together, about how he'd made her feel chosen, special, different from everyone else who'd ever entered his orbit. "I was never special," she said, the words tasting like ash. "Emma, I was just another acquisition." The realization settled over her like a shroud. All of it was fake. The chemistry, the connection, the way he looked at me like I was the only woman in the world who could understand him. Catherine reached across the desk to touch her hand. "I'm sorry. I know how much you cared about him." Emma pulled her hand away, something cold and hard crystallizing in her chest where her heart used to be. "How much time do I have?" "The board meeting is at 10 a.m. tomorrow. David expects you to present the integration strategy as a fait accompli, and if I refuse, he'll present it without you and position your absence as a regrettable professional disagreement. Your contract has that non-compete clause. You'd be finished in marketing." Emma stood and walked to her window, staring down at the people moving through the streets like ants in a complex colony. Somewhere down there, Richard was probably having dinner with his wife, unaware that his life's work was about to be carved up and sold for parts. Her former colleagues were going to bed thinking they still had careers to wake up to. She'd betrayed them all for the love of a man who'd been playing an elaborate game where she was never the player, only another piece to be moved around the board. Her reflection in the window looked like a stranger, perfectly groomed, expensively dressed, successful by every metric that had once mattered to her. But behind her professional facade, Emma could see the woman she'd been before ambition had eaten away at her conscience like acid. "Catherine," she said without turning around, "how much damage could I do to Sterling Industries if I wanted to?" There was a long pause. "What kind of damage?" Emma turned to face her, and Catherine took a small step backward at whatever she saw in Emma's expression, the kind that would make David Sterling understand exactly what happens when you underestimate the woman you're trying to destroy. "Emma, think about this carefully. If you go to war with David, you need to be prepared for the consequences. He's not someone who forgives or forgets, neither am I." Emma walked back to her desk and opened her laptop. If David wanted to play games with people's lives, she'd show him what real strategy looked like. She'd been holding back, trying to be the good partner, the team player who colored inside the lines he'd drawn for her. But David had made a crucial miscalculation. He'd assumed that because he could manipulate her emotions, he could control her actions. He'd forgotten that the woman who'd destroyed his ex-wife's political career was still lurking beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to remind him why you should never underestimate someone with nothing left to lose.
Ow.
Her fingers flew across the keyboard as she began crafting an email to every major business publication in the city. If David wanted to announce his acquisition tomorrow, she'd make sure the narrative wasn't quite the victory story he'd planned. "Emma," Catherine said nervously, "what are you doing?" Something I should have done 3 months ago. Emma's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. I'm reminding David Sterling that some people fight back when you try to destroy them. That email was just the beginning. By morning, David would discover that the woman he'd thought he could use and discard had learned a few things about corporate warfare during her time in his bed. Emma had been naive enough to believe in love. She'd never stopped being smart enough to plan for war. The Wall Street Journal article appeared at 6 a.m., timed perfectly to coincide with the opening bell. Emma had titled it The Sterling Standard, How Corporate Romance Becomes Corporate Raid, and packed it with enough insider details to make David's acquisition strategy read like a predator's handbook. By 7 a.m., her phone was buzzing with calls from reporters, competitors, and federal investigators, suddenly very interested in Sterling Industries' business practices. She sat in her office, watching the sunrise, paint Manhattan in shades of gold and crimson, waiting for the inevitable confrontation. The elevator chimed at 7:45, and Emma didn't need to look up from her coffee to know David had arrived. He appeared in her doorway like a storm front, his usual composure cracked just enough to reveal the fury beneath. Not the perfectly tailored suit couldn't hide the tension in his shoulders or the way his hands clenched at his sides. "Destroy my company and your career in one move," he said, closing the door behind him with controlled violence. Brilliant strategy. Very you. Emma finally looked up, noting the dark circles under his eyes, and the way his jaw worked, like he was chewing glass. I learned from the best. Do you have any idea what you've done? David moved closer to her desk, his voice dropping to that dangerous register she'd once found seductive. The SEC is launching an investigation. 3 board members have already called emergency meetings. Sterling stock price dropped 15% in the first hour of trading. Good. Emma leaned back in her chair, projecting a calm she didn't entirely feel. Maybe next time you'll think twice before treating people like acquisitions. People. David's laugh was harsh. You mean like Richard, who's been embezzling from his own company for 2 years? Like your colleagues who will have jobs at Sterling instead of unemployment benefits? I was saving Pinnacle, Emma. You've killed it. You're feeding off its corpse. There's a difference. David slammed his hands on her desk, leaning forward until their faces were inches apart. You want to know the truth? Fine. Yes, I orchestrated our meeting. Yes, I researched you, planned every conversation, every touch, every moment we spent together. But what happened between us became real despite all of that. Emma felt something crack inside her chest at the admission. Real for who? The woman you thought you were manipulating, or the asset you were acquiring? For both. David's voice broke slightly. I fell in love with the woman who was smart enough to see through my games and ruthless enough to destroy me for playing them. Does that make me a monster? Probably. Does it make what we had any less true? I don't think so. For a moment, Emma glimpsed the man she'd thought she'd known. Vulnerable, brilliant, carrying wounds that had shaped him into something that couldn't trust or be trusted. She almost softened, almost let herself believe that love could exist in the wreckage of manipulation and betrayal. Then she remembered Richard's face when she'd left Pinnacle, the trust he'd placed in her and how she'd repaid it by walking away when he needed her most. It doesn't matter, she said quietly. You taught me that people are just moves on a board. Congratulations, I'm a very good student. David straightened, his expression shifting from desperate to calculating. The non-compete clause in your contract is ironclad. You'll never work in marketing again. If I choose to enforce it, then enforce it. Emma stood, meeting his gaze directly. But understand what happens next. I have copies of every communication, every financial document, every piece of evidence of how you've operated for the past decade. The journal article was just the appetizer. You're bluffing. Emma pulled out a flash drive and set it on the desk between them. 7 women, David. 7 brilliant women whose careers and companies you consumed. I found them all, and they're very interested in sharing their stories with federal investigators. The color drained from David's face. Emma, if you release that information, it won't just destroy me. It'll bring down Sterling Industries. Hundreds of employees will lose their jobs. Pension funds that invested in us will take massive losses. I know. Emma picked up the flash drive, weighing it in her palm like she was holding David's entire empire. Collateral damage, right? That's what you called the pinnacle employees whose lives you were planning to disrupt. What do you want? I want you to honor the original agreement with Richard. Full price, all employees retained, management structure intact. Pinnacle becomes a sterling subsidiary, not a meal to be digested. David's jaw worked as he calculated costs and benefits. That deal will cost me $40 million more than my current offer. Consider it tuition for the education you gave me in corporate warfare. They stared at each other across the desk. Two predators who'd found their perfect match and discovered it meant mutual destruction. Emma could see David weighing his options, probably calculating whether he could neutralize the threat she represented. And if I agree? He asked finally. Then your secrets stay secret, your company stays intact, and you never have to see me again. Something flickered in David's eyes at her last words. Pain, maybe, or regret for the path that had brought them to this moment. You'd walk away from everything? Salary, the position, the life we could have built together? The life we could have built was always a lie. Emma stood and walked to her window one last time, looking down at the city that had witnessed her transformation from idealistic young woman to something harder and more dangerous. You turned me into someone I don't recognize. Hey, David. The least I can do is use those skills to protect the people you taught me to sacrifice. David was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. I did love you, Emma. Whatever else you believe about me, that was real. She turned to look at him, this man who'd shown her the heights of ambition and the depths of betrayal. I loved you too. That's why this hurts so much. It doesn't have to end this way. Yes, it does. Emma walked to her desk and picked up the single box of personal items she'd packed that morning. Some things break so completely that you can't put them back together. Or one of those things. David stepped aside as she approached the door, but his hand shot out to stop her at the last moment. His fingers wrapped around her wrist with desperate gentleness. What happens now? Emma looked down at his hand on her skin, remembering all the times that touch had made her feel chosen, special, loved. Now you become the man who saves Pinnacle instead of destroying it. And I become the woman who walked away from everything to do the right thing. Maybe we'll both sleep better. She pulled free from his grip and walked toward the elevator, feeling his gaze follow her like a weight she couldn't shed. As the doors closed between them, Emma caught one last glimpse of David Sterling standing in the hallway of his empire, looking like a king who'd just discovered his kingdom was built on quicksand. The elevator descended through 47 floors of ambition, carrying her away from the life she'd thought she wanted, towards something uncertain but honest. When the doors opened onto the street level, Emma stepped out into Manhattan morning light that felt like absolution. 6 months later, she stood in Richard Hampton's rebuilt office at Pinnacle Advertising, now a thriving subsidiary of Sterling Industries with full operational independence. The Hartwell Foundation campaign had grown into a multi-year partnership that employed twice as many people as before the acquisition. Richard looked older but happier, his relief at salvation evident in every gesture. David Sterling kept his word, he said, reviewing the quarterly reports. I have to admit, I didn't expect that level of honor from a corporate raider. Emma smiled, thinking about the man who'd taught her that love and destruction could occupy the same heart. People can surprise you. She'd taken a position with a small nonprofit focused on corporate accountability, using her skills to help companies navigate ethical challenges instead of engineering their downfall. The salary was a fraction of what Sterling had offered, but she slept through the night for the first time in years. Sometimes she wondered what David was doing, whether he'd learned anything from their mutual destruction. The business magazines still featured him occasionally, always photographed alone, always described as brilliant and ruthless and untouchable. Emma kept the articles in a drawer she never opened, like pressed flowers from a garden that had burned to the ground. Some loves were too dangerous to survive, but too powerful to forget. She'd chosen to save the people David taught her to sacrifice, and in doing so, she'd saved something of herself as well. The city sprawled beyond her office window, full of ambitious people making impossible choices between their hearts and their careers. Emma watched them move through their complicated lives and felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Hope that some of them would choose better than she had. Hope that some of them would recognize love when it wore the mask of destruction and be strong enough to walk away. I hope that some of them would remember that the most important battles were fought not for what you could gain, but for who you could remain in the process. The end.